Hello, I'm Vivian Hamilton. I'm a professor at the law school and the founding director of the William & Mary Center for Racial and Social Justice. I'm so grateful to have the opportunity to share a bit with you about some of the work I do at William & Mary. I'm going to talk a little about the subject matter of one of the courses I teach, which is a course that examines race in the law in the US. I'll then introduce you briefly to the work that we are undertaking campus-wide to make William & Mary, the Commonwealth, and our nation more inclusive and more just. Maybe I'll start by sharing with you what got me interested in issues of race, law, and social justice. My mother was an undocumented immigrant from Paraguay, a country in the middle of South America, and she was a domestic worker. She became a citizen a number of years after marrying my father, who was a US-born postal worker. We lived in a Black neighborhood in Washington, D.C., but with the help of a nonprofit organization, the Black Student Fund, my sister and I attended mostly white private schools in a very different part of D.C. So I've always had a foot in two different worlds. For example, after school and on weekends, I often helped my mom clean houses. On my first day at this private school, I discovered that one of the houses we cleaned belonged to one of my new classmates. It was awkward at the time, at least at first, but I'm still Facebook friends with both that classmate and her mother. So my identity and upbringing meant that I was always intensely aware of and interested in issues of race, ethnicity, and class. And usually, in school and work, my experience of these things was that of an outsider. When I came to William & Mary, the law school didn't have a course in race in the law, and some of the students and I thought we should. I developed a course called Race, Law, and Lawyering in Diverse Environments. In the first part of the course, we study the legal history of race and race relations in the United States. I thought I'd talk about some of that history today. To be clear, we don't study our history as an exercise in self-flagellation or nation-hating. We study our history to understand our present and to understand how we've arrived at our present. How exactly did we get here? So this is a law school class examining race, and so we begin, as we must, with the legal system, specifically on the laws that were enacted to protect and enshrine slavery. In the colonies, more than a century before the Declaration of Independence, laws regulated enslaved people, including establishing the status of children born to enslaved women. As you can see, law declared that enslaved women would give birth to generations of children whose legal status would be not persons, but instead commodities. This natural increase of the enslaved population allowed the colonies, and later the United States, to become a slave nation. Laws like these also secured wealth for European colonists and generations of their descendants. Now, slavery has existed in various forms across the globe for centuries. What made slavery and its legacy so pernicious in the United States? Arguably, the development of white racism against blacks. Racism served a number of functions. First, by relegating Africans and their descendants as inferior to whites, it recast slavery as consistent with the natural order. In other words, racism justified slavery. Second, it resulted in poorer whites who otherwise might have seen that they shared interests with enslaved black laborers, instead aligning themselves with other whites. Slaveholding whites, who always felt threatened by the danger of insurrection, of course, encouraged that alignment. It was that alignment that prevented alliances between poor whites and enslaved blacks. Arguably, we continue to see the legacy of this divisive function of racism today. In 1776, of course, Thomas Jefferson wrote the document in which the colonies declared their independence from Britain, and in which the signers professed their belief that all men are created equal. Now, you can never truly know what's in a man's heart, but we are all the products of our environments, historical and otherwise, and evidence suggests that this professed belief in universal equality was less fact and more rhetorical flourish. When we study the Constitution, the document that literally constituted our nation, we come to understand that without protections for the institution of slavery written into that very document, the U.S. as we know it would likely not have come into being at all. These protections were compromises and concessions granted to the slaveholding states to entice them into joining the Union. I'll give a couple examples. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, referred to as the Commerce Clause, gives Congress one of its most expansive and important powers, the power to regulate commerce and trade. Except Article 1, Section 9 carved out a very specific exception to this power. Although Congress otherwise had the power to regulate commerce, Section 9 prohibited Congress from enacting any law to ban the importation of enslaved people until 1808, some 20 years after the Constitution's ratification. So Congress was constitutionally prohibited from interfering with the slave trade. In an excerpt from a 1788 speech, James Madison explained and justified Article 1, Section 9. In order to not risk losing the slaveholding states, the framers agreed to countenance not only the continued subjugation of enslaved people already in the country, but the continued trafficking of people from Africa into the United States for the first decades of the nation's existence. A second example of our Constitution's protecting the institution of slavery appears in the Fugitive Slave Clause, which provided that an enslaved person escaping into a state where slavery was illegal, a free state, would not be automatically freed upon entering that state. Instead, slave owners' property rights in their human property extended across state borders. Now, when the Emancipation Proclamation was issued in 1863, it didn't free all enslaved people. It only freed blacks in states that were in rebellion. That left nearly 1 million black people enslaved in the states not rebelling. Enslaved people in the Union states that permitted slavery, Delaware, Kentucky, Maryland, Missouri, West Virginia, remained enslaved until the ratification of the 13th Amendment in 1865 following the Civil War. It was that amendment that finally ended the institution that had endured for some 250 years. During Reconstruction that followed, when federal troops occupied the South, black men voted for the first time and even held office. But white Southerners, intent on beating back Reconstruction efforts, mounted relentless terror campaigns, attacking black people for all sorts of reasons and no reason at all. Black freedmen migrated north, where they typically worked in low-paying, low-skilled jobs, rail and mill workers, hotel, and other service labor. In the South, white landowners broke up large plantations and rented small lots to freedmen, developing a system of sharecropping. Landowners regularly exploited the tenant farmers who worked their land. Reconstruction ended with the withdrawal of federal troops in 1877. From 1890 to 1908, the Southern states passed new state constitutions and laws that disfranchised most blacks and many poor whites with new voter registration and electoral rules, including subjectively administered literacy tests. States adopted and enforced black codes, which were laws that regulated black people's lives, subjecting them to arrest for vagrancy, loitering, not carrying proper identification, breaking curfew, etc. Black people were put in jail for violating a whole range of these laws. Convict leasing provided prisoner labor to private parties, landowners, coal mining corporations, lumber corporations. These private parties would pay a fee to the state and then benefit from the free labor of the prisoners. Now, the 14th Amendment was ratified in 1868, and it guaranteed the quote-unquote equal protection of the laws. But early efforts to enforce the 14th Amendment's guarantees failed, and black codes and other laws enforced a segregated society that was profoundly unequal. And in 1896, the Supreme Court upheld a Louisiana law requiring equal but separate train cars for black and white passengers. It would be several decades before the court would reverse itself and hold in Brown versus Board of Education in 1954 that separate was inherently unequal. Before that, though, federal social welfare law enacted in the 1930s as part of Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal resulted in radically unequal benefits to people of different races with lasting consequences. Two programs created during the New Deal were the Homeowners Loan Corporation and the Federal Housing Administration, the FHA, which insured private mortgages. The programs led to a drop in interest rates and a decline in the amount of down payment required to buy a house. Those changes made home ownership the most significant opportunity for wealth accumulation in the nation's history. But the FHA wouldn't insure neighborhoods where black people lived, literally coloring these neighborhoods in red. The mortgage industry, too, engaged in redlining, and black people were denied the legitimate government-backed mortgages that enabled white families to accumulate wealth. Instead, they were funneled into communities in the center of cities, deprived of new investment, and where homes lost value. This is a 1939 map of Chicago, produced by the Homeowners Loan Corporation. Residents of the areas marked in red were denied FHA-backed mortgages, and those were overwhelmingly black neighborhoods. The housing and education benefits of the GI Bill, too, were denied to black veterans by local Veterans Administration offices, and the Fair Labor Standards Act exempted agricultural and service occupations, which disproportionately disadvantaged black workers. To quote from a February report from this year from the Brookings Institution, quote, "Wealth was taken from these communities before it had the opportunity to grow," end quote. And the legacy of these government-created discriminatory practices is reflected in inequalities today. So today, largely due to discriminatory housing law and policy, the median family wealth of white households is 10 times that of black households. And black Americans continue to be the most segregated of the racial groups. Black home buyers are still more likely than white home buyers to be steered towards subprime mortgages and predatory loans. Black college graduates have higher unemployment rates than white college graduates. Black job applicants with no criminal record get hired at roughly the same rate as white applicants with criminal records. Decades of poorer housing and work environments has contributed to poorer health and chronic health conditions. Lack of access to health care exacerbate these. And we witness today the disproportionate effect of a national pandemic on communities of color. We also witness a collective popular uprising against centuries of racial injustice. What is our role? What can we, specifically, we as members of the William and Mary community, do? As President Catherine Rowe has urged, acknowledgement and understanding must become action. As researchers and scholars, we have the training and skills to deeply study the pressing challenges facing our communities today and to begin to identify solutions. As educators, we are ideally positioned to introduce students to the many dimensions of injustice and equip them to engage in work to advance justice. As community members, our university community, Hampton Roads, the Commonwealth, and the national and global communities, we share an obligation to take action to make each of these communities more equitable and just. To pursue these goals, we have, this semester, established a Center for Racial and Social Justice. The center will work to advance the cause of racial and social justice by educating students in the broader community, building students' capacity to engage in social justice work, and engaging in legal and multidisciplinary research and advocacy aimed to inform the public, advocates, and policymakers, both in the Commonwealth of Virginia and nationwide. With seed funding from the provost, we are beginning important programming this semester, despite the pandemic. In fact, our inaugural program was a brilliant talk by William & Mary epidemiologist Dr. Iyabo Obasanjo, who explained the many facets of the pandemic's disproportionate effect on people of color. We are working to harness the expertise and resources we already have here at William & Mary, faculty and students alike, to make the impact we are able to make on the culture at William & Mary, as well as across our varied communities. We invite you, as members of our community, to join us. Thank you so much for sharing your time with me.